pick the 7th club. Here we go.
Where, Barry, where? Tell us, Barry. We eagerly await your next syllable. What will it be? What gem of knowledge? What pearl of wisdom? Do you want to buy a vowel, Barry?
Just shut.
Is that your final answer?
All right. You have to turn off the TV from time to time. From my foot, the kick up into 7.
We will juggle 7.
From 6 to 7.
That's a world's record.
Really?
For us.
Yes.
Here we go, Barry. Whenever you're ready there, big guy. Put your tongue away, Barry. I'm tired.
Whoa.
Whoa. How about that? Please stay seated. Stay seated. Thank you. Because now, to make this twice as difficult, we'll juggle the 7 clubs
7
back.
club juggling.
2 back.
Thank you. That's it. Up.
Looky.
It's finished. Up. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. There, that's it. Thank you very much. Thanks, buddy.
Put the commercial on.
I'd rather eat yellow snow than shop in a crowded mall. Even going near one gives me hives. So go right ahead and schedule me an enema so I don't have to go inside. And I'll buy all my gifts online at Amazon. They have everything so I don't have to shove bamboo underneath all my fingernails. That would
Do 2 short little ones. This one is, I was hired to write a little jingle for this .com company that's no longer around, search engine thing, and they wanted me to talk about how great the new technology is. All my friends are passing me by. The web is spinning crazy before my eyes, but I don't have the stuff to make me fly. I'm an analog girl. I got a black and white TV as old as it gets. Still listen to Leo Sayers on my 8-track cassette. I'm the most unconnected person you met. I'm an analog girl. But everything changed when I met the man with the mighty search engine and the big broadband. He took me by the hand. I'll change your world. I'll change your world. That's all. I didn't get the gig. But
Wait a minute. Lunge? So we won't start with the rest of it. Just tell them we can't start with them. We'll do them at the end or something.
this is about the anorexic at my gym. Lucy at the gym, she's there every time I go, and I don't go that often, so she must live at the gym. I stare at her ribs, they show through the spandex. Her little legs are working, she's going somewhere. She's climbing up the stairs, and when she reaches the top, her dreams will be there. Lucy at the gym, Lucy on the scale for the third time, through thick and thin. Lucy's at the gym. She's staring at the clock, and like the second 10, she never stops. She's Lucy at the gym. When she takes a shower, after all the hours, does she have a place to go? Does she have a place to go? Is there someone waiting? Or is Lucy all alone? I'm at the gym, and Lucy's not there. It's got me kind of worried, so I imagine the worst. She made it up to heaven, and when she met her maker, he said, "Come right in." He said, "I'll show you around the gym. Everyone's beautiful and thin. And here there's no sins, and your life can begin." Lucy at the gym. Keep on, Lucy. Keep on working, girl. Keep on, Lucy. Keep on working, 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 working. Lucy at the gym.
Not to sort of do a tour d'horizon of technology, but to talk about a little bit about some of my observations from what I actually do for a living. And for those of you who don't know, I write actually 2 technology columns a week in the Wall Street Journal, and have just had my 10th anniversary in doing that. And and thank you. And but this is really my second career at the Wall Street Journal. I started there when I was very young, and have been there 31 years. And I spent 18 years, the 18 years before I started the technology column, covering all of the things that you see on the news now when they're not reporting on, crooked ice skating judging. And that is national security, defense, foreign policy, counterterrorism, the intelligence community. And I actually spent a few years in the 80s as the Wall Street Journal's chief international economic correspondent. A big part of my job then was actually talking to Alan Greenspan and trying to figure out what the hell he was saying. And so the transition, and then one day, in 1991, at the beginning of that year, if you were to look back at the archives of the Wall Street Journal, you would see big front page stories with my byline about the Gulf War, about Iraqi missiles hitting the towns in Israel. And at the end of that year, you would see me writing about software and computers. And there were a lot of reasons I made the switch. Some of them had to do with family. I was putting in 150,000 miles or more over the previous few years on the Secretary of State's airplane. Communism was collapsing. Eastern Europe was being liberated. We had the Gulf War. There was a lot going on. And I wanted to see my kids. I didn't realize I'd be taking 60 trips to California, but it was a little more predictable than the State Department calling up and saying, hey, we're going to Uzbekistan tomorrow, which is the kind of thing they did. But another big reason I did it was not that I didn't think what I had been covering was important, but that I did think that we had a new era opening up in computer technology, digital technology, where it would become more democratized and more available to people who were not techies and gearheads. And yet I thought there was a disconnect, because I thought, and I still think, that a lot of the industry that produces this stuff, whether it's web services or PCs or cell phones or any of this stuff, is basically run by this techno elite, which in its private moments has significant disdain for the bulk of the population and very little feel for how they live. And I suggested to the Journal, which you all know is an organ of a populist rebellion, I suggested to the Journal that whereas most of the newspaper columns that were writing about and reviewing technology were written by geeks for geeks and had a sort of condescending attitude toward normal people and a reverential attitude toward the industry, that we should turn that on its head. And that I would like to have an attitude of championing non-technical but smart people, people who are smart about the things that matter in their life, but have no interest in knowing how their car or their computer runs, and be critical of the industry insofar as it seemed to me it wasn't serving those people. So we set all this up, and I went to see the Secretary of State of the United States, James Addison Baker, same charming fellow who represented Bush in Florida during the vote counting, or should I say the no vote counting episode, but who was, frankly, a very good Secretary of State, and before that a very good Treasury Secretary, a very smart man with whom I had had a reasonable relationship, some periods when he refused to talk to me for a month or two, but other than that it was okay. And I went to see him in the, I don't know how many of you have been in the Secretary of State's office, but it's a ornate, lovely office, and I went in there and I said, Mr. Secretary, I'm leaving the beat. I'm not going to be covering you anymore on foreign policy. And he said, oh, so you're going to the White House beat, or you're becoming an editor, or what? I said, no, I'm going to actually start writing a column about computers. And he looked at me. This is a guy who talks to all kinds of wacky foreign leaders all day, but he looked at me like he had never heard anything so ridiculous. He said to me, quote, this is his diplomatic quote, what the fuck do you want to go and do that for? I've actually never talked about this in public, but it was sort of an amazing, because we were off the record, but After Florida, I figure, what the hell? It wasn't so much that I wanted Gore to win in Florida, because he was such a jerk too, but I thought votes ought to be counted. It was just sort of the way I grew up, And he said, what the fuck do you want to do that for? He said, I don't know shit about computers. And I said, well, that's kind of the point. He just sort of shrugged his shoulders, and I mean, the word that was put out among his people was that maybe I was being fired or demoted, or, they didn't know. And I really didn't know how this change would go for me. I certainly wasn't the first person to write a column like this, but it was and is, those of you who've seen it, a highly opinionated column in a very powerful newspaper, a newspaper which is one of only 2 or 3 that has a platform where if you have an opinionated column, you really are speaking to a lot of very influential people. And a couple of interesting things happened. First of all, I learned that even inside Washington, where I had lived for a long time and still live, people began to be very interested in talking to me because they wanted to know about technology. And in fact, when the first Bush administration was defeated by Clinton, I became almost the personal computer shopper for a lot of these assistant secretaries and deputy secretaries who had basically been locked in a room in the White House for, since Reagan. And I took one woman out, a very prominent person in the Republican administration, to CompUSA, And she had no idea such a place existed. I swear to God, I mean, she just didn't. To them, the computer was a clerical tool. Their secretaries typed in it. You know, Baker, who I repeat, is a smart guy. Baker had a computer behind his desk so that when the visiting finance ministers and prime ministers and people would come to Washington, they would see he had this computer. It literally had a color-coded keyboard. There was one key on it that he could work. He pushed that key, and the value of the dollar against the other currencies came up on the screen. That's it. So he could say to, you know, I mean, he's sitting there with like the Japanese finance minister. He'd say, you know, the dollar is, let me see what it is. Pushes the one key. That's it. But let me tell you something. In the world of finance ministers, that was high tech. That blew him away. The other thing that happened was what I call the cocktail party effect. When I started my column, it was over the opposition of a fair amount of the hierarchy at the Journal. The actual managing editor, who was the boss of the paper, at that time was Norm Pearlstein, who has been at TED and spoken, and he's now the editor-in-chief of Time Inc. And he agreed to let me do this column in a 5-minute oral conversation. This is how unbusinesslike newspapers are. You know, no meetings, no memos. He just said, okay. But meanwhile, when all of his deputies heard about it, they all were horrified because some of it may have been me and some of it may have been the topic, but a lot of it was, I don't know how many of you who read the Journal would even know this, but we had this arcane rule at the Journal that had been in effect for 30 or 40 years that said you could not have a column in the news pages of the Journal. Now, I'm not talking about the editorial page, which is a whole, that's like, they basically do that on Mars. That's a different thing. But in the news pages of the Journal, there was a rule that you could not have a column that was one single essay and that was highly subjective and opinionated. You couldn't have it on any topic. All the columns, and I'd actually written several columns in the Journal on labor and on foreign policy and on a number of things, had to be little sort of newsy items. So this was a big cultural change in an institution that didn't do very radical changes very often. And when I started the column, everyone held their breath for a while. It was read every week for about 10 weeks by everyone right on through the publisher, word for word before it went out, which is unusual. And to their credit, nobody asked me to change anything. I don't remember who I was pissing off in those first 10 weeks, but it was somebody, I don't know who. And then the cocktail party effect set in. And the publisher and the editors began to go to cocktail parties, and people would say, gee, that's an interesting new column. Who is this guy? You know, what's that? And then they all calmed down, and it's been okay ever since for 10 years. But I soon noticed something that I think is really a little bit sad. And it's that, at least among the readers of the Wall Street Journal, who are highly educated, highly influential, very rich, they seemed to, from my anecdotal evidence, they seemed to be more passionate and more concerned about the most trivial aspects of computers and technology than they were about all that important stuff I used to cover. I spent, and I just tell you this, it's amazed me, and I don't think it's a good sign for the country, but it's true. I wrote all through the 80s about, I broke a story about our nuclear war fighting strategy, that we actually had these plans to fight a war with nuclear weapons, not merely to deter one. I wrote about Pan Am 103, which was the most notorious terrorist incident for many years. People dying. I wrote about wars. I wrote about the overthrow of the Shah in Iran. I wrote about the Gulf War. I wrote about Saddam Hussein. I wrote about the CIA and what it was doing. I wrote about arms control, and even things like trade, which are not quite as horrifying in some respects, but very important. I got maybe 2 letters a year in those years. That was it. 2 letters a year. And one didn't really count because it was from some anti-Semite in Indiana. It was written in orange crayon along the side of a ripped-out newspaper article. So I didn't really count that. So maybe 1 letter. And that was it. Now, I admit this was before email, or at least before email was in wide use, or as wide use as today, but still. and this was not just me. I mean, all of us, and I think this was true of the folks at the New York Times and the Washington Post and elsewhere, all of us who wrote about these important things, you would never hear from the readers. You would hear from the professional letter to the editor writers, and that was okay. But you would never hear from your average reader. You had no real connection with the audience. The subject did not seem to bring people out. But as soon as I started writing about, whether to buy a Mac or a Windows machine, or, whether to use Quicken or Microsoft Money or WordPerfect or Word, I mean, my God, I started to receive 100 emails a day. I now get about 200 to 250 emails a day. Now, some of it is PR people, and some of it is spam, and some of it is some other stuff, but a lot of it is readers who are just, some of it is questions and they're confused, but some of them are just either outraged or elated about their computer. And since I am, as those of you who read me know, fairly opinionated, some of them think I'm just out of my mind, and some of them think I'm right. But they are moved to write about this stuff, where they were not moved in all those years. And the circulation of the journal has been about the same, I'm sorry to say, for all this period. And so it isn't a function of that. They just weren't moved to write about the other stuff. Even though, as much as I am interested in writing about technology, and it is important for our future, I would say that some of these other things were even more immediately important, and they didn't care about them. Even after September 11th, the pace of this passion about this stuff, at least as I see it in my email box, has not dropped off. And I'm not saying those folks don't care about what happened on September 11th or that their lives weren't changed, but they still seem to have an inexhaustible capacity to want to argue about this computer stuff. So I thought I brought some email to read, some representative email. Now, these aren't exactly the real email because I want to treat that as sort of confidential, but believe me, these are very similar to the email I get. I'll just read you, I'm not going to read you whole long emails, but I'll just read you a little bit of the common types. And those of you who wrote some of these can raise your hand later. Dear Mr. Mossberg, how can you review any Windows laptop without mentioning the Apple PowerBook? It kicks ass. You must be on Bill Gates' payroll. You never write about Apple. Dear sir, why are you always writing about Apple? How much of their stock do you own? You must be on Steve Jobs' payroll. Dear sir, you are always complaining and whining about Microsoft. What are you, a communist? You must be on Larry Ellison's payroll. I'm surprised the journal editorial page allows your crap to be published. Hi, honey. Me and my hot-looking sorority sisters Did you? Me and my hot-looking sorority sisters were just dancing naked in front of our webcam. Click here to see us before our boyfriends find out. You've gotten that one, right? Dear Walt, you are my favorite columnist. I follow all your advice. I want to have your baby. Now I need your help. Those bastards at Palm won't give me a new PDA to replace the one that broke when I dropped it off a cliff into the Colorado River. Can you imagine? Dear Mr. Mossberg, we met at TED in 1997. I was the one in the blue shirt standing sort of near the lady in the tight pants. Enlarge your penis and your breasts without a doctor's prescription. Miracle drugs sold only online. Dear sir, I know you usually cover only consumer technology, but I really think your readers would want to know about our new line of digital fuel injectors for aircraft carriers. Now this one I've actually gotten, I think, at least 3 times in 10 years. May I call you Walt? I feel like I know you. All my friends say we look like twins. See the enclosed picture. This proves that there are too many paunchy, bald, middle-aged Jewish guys with time on their hands. Mossberg, if you're so smart, why don't you just go out and create your own operating system and just try to get as rich as Bill Gates? Walt, I never miss your column. Can you help me? Every time I boot up my PC, I get a warning on the screen that says, duck and cover. What am I doing wrong? People send the most elaborate descriptions of their PC problems, and I'm supposed to sit there and diagnose it, from DC. My answer is usually, bring it back to the store and demand a refund as if it was a television that didn't work, I mean, people have this odd attitude. If the PC doesn't work, they're supposed to roll up their sleeves and fix it. But if you bought a television and it didn't get channel 5, you wouldn't try to fix it. And that's one of the things that sets me apart from the other computer columnists, because the other guys in their Q&A columns, and yes, they are all guys, will say, oh, here's what you do. Take a screwdriver, go in here, go into the registry, type the following 800 lines. No, bring it back to the damn store. And finally, this is representative of so many PR emails I've gotten, and of course I get many of those since September 11th. They try to weave September 11th into their pitch. The tragic events of September 11th have left us all realizing just how precious life is. That's why we at Big Buzz PR hope you'll consider reviewing the new website, yourpancreas.com. It's not much less weird than that. From our client, Obscure Organs of Petaluma, California. Well, I've never known what to make of this ferment about, and when I say ferment about technology, I'm not even talking about big picture, save the world stuff. I'm literally talking about, this is no exaggeration, the insufficient adulation of the Mac. I didn't even read you the ones from Linux people who think I ought to be recommending this to moms and dads. Everybody fire up your Linux PC, It has just never ceased to amaze me, particularly in the context of my 2 careers. So thanks.
No?
Now.
Better?
you are.
Good.
Yeah.
There was a dinner last night that was a little like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where one by one each of the TED-aholics got up and confessed, their shameless embarrassment at some TED moment or other. And it struck me that for many years I never came to TED because I was very happy at MIT. And in fact, it seemed to me like the Media Lab was, when it was in full swing, very much like TED all year round. So why should I go to California? Anyway, Nicholas was always here, and there was sort of the Mike, Nick, matter, antimatter thing. So, but the fact of the matter is TED is much more interesting than that, as you all know. And I consider it to be a real thrill to be among you in the audience, and a magnificent part of my own education to be here. I said last night to the meeting that I think TED qualifies as a living national treasure because the people in the audience, the people who speak, are among the greatest creative forces in our civilization, and it's a unique thing. So, Richard, I just wanted to thank you very much for the opportunity. When I was flying out here, my assistant at MIT asked me what I was going to speak about, and I said, well, we're talking about design of technology. And he said, yeah. And
So like computers and stuff? I said, yeah, I like computers. They're really interesting. And, they've got consequences for our culture. And when I arrived at TED, a bunch of people said, so you going to play the piano again? And I said, well, I was going to talk about technology. And they said, oh, well, geez. And what I think I would actually do, since so many people asked me if I was going to play, is a tiny little minute-and-a-half piece. We have time. I can do
The whole
whatever.
thing can be the piano,
What's that?
as long as you want in the piano, until I, pull the plug.
Well, this is a miniature little piece. It's one of these things I can't believe I had to wait 39 years of my life to stumble across. Just a really, we'll see what you think of it. And it actually gets us into what I really do want to say. So that was actually a violin piece ripped off by a guy named Leopold Godowsky. violin piece was a slow movement from a Bach violin sonata. When I heard it on the violin, I forgot it instantly. It's just not one of Bach's better things. But Godowsky loved this. And I don't know if anybody, you have to be a piano-aholic to even know the name of Leopold Godowsky. In fact, those of you who do know the name of Godowsky probably know it because Leopold Godowsky II was the guy who invented Kodachrome. He teamed up with Leopold Mannis, two Leopolds. They used to call him God and Man. And they were upstart inventors who just loved color photography, and they invented Kodachrome. But the story I want to give you, which I think nicely gets us into my remarks, is that Godowsky was a revered pianist. Rachmaninoff idolized the guy. Godowsky played rings around everybody, just a phenomenon. And something else unusual about him, he was very, very short. He was a tiny little guy. And after a concert, a fan came up to Leopold Godowsky and said, "Oh, Mr. Godowsky, you play the piano so beautifully, but how is it you're able to make such magnificent music with such teeny-weeny little fingers?" And Godowsky looked at her and he said, "My dear woman, what in the world gave you the idea that we play music with our fingers?" And that I've never forgotten, even though many people have forgotten who Godowsky was. It's just so important to everything we do. And last night I ran into Quincy Jones. I asked him if he was too busy to make music anymore with all the charitable work he's doing in Africa and so forth. He said, "Man, it's all music." And it is all music. Certainly is to me. So what I want to do is show you very quickly 4 slices, little projects that I've had the great joy to be involved with over the past year and a half. That are kind of interesting. The first 2 are technical, and the second 2 are sort of people-oriented. And the question underlying them is, if you really want to produce better technology designs, you have to wonder about the people who actually do the designing. Are the right kinds of human beings with the right inspirations at work there? Or are we getting the sorts of products that you would expect from the level of humanity and inspiration that is at work? And incidentally, just as a backdrop, we've all lived through this, but I look over what's happened in the last 20 years of information technologies the same way that Captain Kirk looked at the demo of the Genesis planet. Remember, a lifeless moon, and all of a sudden, whoosh, this wave of verdant greenery and ocean spread over the planet. And we've seen computer technologies do this. I mean, in terms of capacity, they rocketed through early text processing and sound processing, picture processing, movie processing. Now half of George Lucas's actors are synthetic. And it's not stopping and it's not slowing down. And the way computers connect is also sort of on the same tidal wave of a curve. The internet is it's the tip of an iceberg. And so I guess icebergs gets us into this. This was an expedition that my students conducted to Iceland. Why is a long story, but to make it very short, one of the students was a marathon runner, was interested in training, but it was a cold winter, so he took up cross-country skiing. But although it was cold, there was no snow in New England. However, Iceland Air had a 2-for-1 deal, $199 round trip from Boston. It was closer than California, and genuine Arctic conditions. So we went there thanks to the good graces of DARPA, who were interested in field deployment of interesting new sensor networks. And this is what the students built. They were sort of computerized cross-country skis, which sounds a little nutty, but what they wanted to do was understand the kinematics of skiing. Build a skidometer, tell you how fast you're actually going, measure whether or not this kind of waxing technique is actually working the way it should. And so built onto the skis are little teeny-weeny computers, but there's a sort of problem. I mean, you go skiing up a glacier, and you eat your snack, and you ski, and it's cold. It's very cold. And at a certain point, you naturally have to pee. Now, peeing's not so bad because you can leave your skis on. But if you have to do number 2, this is a problem. And what's rigged up on the skis are like 6 or 7 little tiny wires that go up your trousers legs and into the computer that you're schlepping in your backpack. And so you've got to reach down, you take off your mittens, these puny little connectors, and pull them all off so you can get the skis off. By the time you're finished, man, your hands are like bricks of ice. And I like to play the piano. I'm thinking, what am I doing here? Well, my mother always used to tell me that if you don't have a problem, there is no solution. So first question I always ask a graduate student at MIT is, man, what is your problem? And even dear old Dr. Land, Edwin Land, always used to say that if you have a problem, any problem, if you can just state it sufficiently clearly, you might be able to solve it. Well, that was an obvious problem, and the solution was to build a wireless network to fix the sensor problem. And in version 2, sure enough, the students did it. You just put on the skis and they worked, and they were talking to the things in the backpack. They didn't realize at the time either how difficult or how magical it would be to have all these little sensors just sort of in telepathic communications. So that stuck with me. The students, they keep getting smarter, and so they called me up one day and said, hey, Mike, we're in Hawaii now. We went on another expedition without you. And we billed it to the DARPA account. We hope you don't mind. And I'm thinking, oh, great. We're flying our students to Hawaii. Well, they were purportedly building a new kind of network, which they called the TEFRAnet. Now, you have to be into this sort of geo-volcanologist lingo to understand this. Tephra is the rocks and schmutz that gets blown out of a volcano. And so they wanted a network that you could just chuck on the side of a hill in Hawaii. It would sort of magically connect to itself. None of this TCP/IP, internet domain name kind of stuff. And the students kept nagging and said, you got to come to Hawaii. It's just not like Boston, and thank God it's not like Iceland. I mean, it's warm here. You won't have the frostbite problem. So I joined them on the Big Island. We went to, see where the green line goes up in the upper right hand? That's Hilo, rainiest city in North America. It's not all wine and roses. And 30 miles to the southwest of Hilo is the zone of our project study. It's the Kilauea Craters, bone-dried desert. And the object of the study is this scrappy little plant. It's called Silene hawaiiensis, a little tiny scruffy weed. You wouldn't even notice it until a ranger writes you a $100,000 fine for stepping on it, because there's only a couple hundred of them on Earth, and they only grow here. And sort of the same way Darwin saw the Galapagos as a test tube, these kinds of organisms make ideal objects for study. They're little pen and ink drawings of evolution. But we don't know anything about the plant. We don't know how it pollinates. We don't know how it survives up there. And to sort of draw the point home, this is another version of, or an instance of the same problem, different plant. It's called portulaca, species of portulaca, but there's only about 100 of them. And they only grow in a little patch over here. And if you walk a football field over and dip a thermometer in the ground, it comes up 250 degrees, because there's hot lava and it's heading this way. And it will wipe out that whole species at some point. Now, scientists at the University of Hawaii have noticed that it's relatively inefficient and ineffective to post a graduate student in the field just dipping a thermometer all day long. You actually have to invent some stuff to do the monitoring for you. So the boys in the laboratory built this teeny-weeny little computer. It's a dime the size of a dinner plate, but don't be fooled. It's got a fancy chip in it and a zillion sensors, measure the soil temperature, the air temperature, the water temperature, all that stuff. Basically collect a time-lapse data image of the ecology around the plant. And an interesting wireless network. These things all chatter with each other, gossip style. It's a bucket brigade. And you basically throw them out in the field just the way you're supposed to, although this being a national park and also being a military-funded project, we had to camouflage the hardware. So we built them into these little polystyrene tubes and photographed tree bark from the local ohia trees. They're like Hawaiian oak trees. And then went out and strung them up in trees. It's really miserable in Hawaii. I don't suggest that you actually try to go there to do your field work. It's not the right place to be, really, trust me. But there's one of our sensors hard at work. I like to think of this as honest-to-goodness data logging. Okay, sorry about that. No, it gets better. Okay. I like the rocks better. These are faux pumice rocks, and you look up close and you see these tiny little sensors, but what's really kind of fun is driving around in a station wagon that's full of supercomputers. And you basically unroll the window, throw a rock out the side, and oops, those are the sensors. By the way, that tiny little sensor, this one, that's the same light level meter that's in the rear view mirror of a Mercedes E-Class sedan. So next time you trip over a rock in Hawaii, you should take a close look. Anyway, there's one of our supercomputers doing its job in the field, which I thought was quite nice. But the image that stuck with me was when my graduate student, Andy Wheeler, walked up to a rock and just logged into it. Started talking to it. And I thought, wow. And the point of these examples is that wireless networking, man, it hasn't begun yet. And for all the Tinker Toy games that people are playing with pagers and cell phones and Bluetooth and 802.11 and all that, it is like trying to imagine what the internet would be like 10 years before the web was invented. Wirelessness, being unwired, is about as close as the human species will ever get to honest-to-God mental telepathy, where the thing over here knows what the thing over there was thinking, and you don't have to do any juggling or connecting or anything to get them mentally in touch. And the sorts of networks that are coming are things that will let you program biological cells directly through radio influence. We've known that that might be possible. It's now been demonstrated in laboratories by Joe Jacobson, for one, back at MIT. And the consequences of that are so mind-boggling that you ought to just talk about it over coffee during the break. So the second two slices, which I'll go through very quickly, have to do with the people who produce technology. And some of you know that I've been involved in some charitable work in Cambodia. This will be a real quickie, but I find it just as interesting. Sort of the human axis as opposed to the technical axis. Cambodia, 12 million people, 6 million under age 15. So it's a nation of children more than any other, still repopulating after the Khmer Rouge. And the kids are beautiful, just as happy as any children you'd ever meet. That's a new school that's being built by friends of Nicholas's and mine in Cambodia. What's interesting about it is that there's a solar panel on the roof. That's important because it's got a bunch of computers inside and a satellite dish outside, with what turns out to be the fastest internet link in the country, middle of nowhere, middle of a little tiny rural village. And what's going on here is that kids are learning how to use computers. Now, this is the way you get taught how to use these odious things. And geez, someday I've got to show this picture to Bill Atkinson, who wrote Mac Paint. You know, Mac Paint menu translated into Khmer script for little punks in the middle of rural jungles of Cambodia. But this is the way you actually learn. And I walked into a classroom and saw this little boy in the red shirt. He turns out to be an orphan from Phnom Penh. But in Phnom Penh, he learned how to play with computers and was sent by the Minister of Education as a computer teacher, age 12. And this is not Lord of the Flies. This is real magic and real power. He walked into a classroom he'd never been in before and wanted to show the kids how you use machines and started drawing this picture. And I walked in and saw the beginnings of that on the screen. Man, my jaw hit the floor, especially after he started dropping in the color. You know, I looked at that and it was like seeing the next Ramanujan or the next Mozart. And when you ask a boy like Li Hao what he wants to be when he grows up, he says, I want to be a teacher. I want to help my family, help my village. That is so disarming to hear from a person who's 12 years old in the middle of a place like rural Cambodia. I can't begin to tell you. The last tiny example I wanted to mention has less to do with the design of technology and more to do with the design of a country. I'm not sure how many of you have been to Bhutan. It's been very much in the news lately. News in the sense of a sudden spontaneous burst of little articles about Bhutan. But for those who don't know it, look on a map. It's a tiny little Shangri-La country snuggled up in the Himalayas in between Nepal, Tibet, and India, mostly above 10,000 feet. It's about the size of Switzerland, 40,000 square kilometers. Population 600,000. Switzerland has 7 million. It's the only underpopulated country in Asia. Famously, it's the last place in the world to get television. 1999 was when they plugged in cable TV, by choice. And only 4,000 visitors a year come. Well, we happened to be there last November doing a photography project with children in Bhutan and stumbled into this dance ceremony. And it's sort of like being in Bali if there'd never been a tourist. Just a riot of color. And while I was there, this beautiful little girl came up to me, 11 years old, and she tugged on my sleeve. And in perfect English, she said, "Mister, are you from America?" And by the way, English is the medium of instruction in schools in Bhutan. So they learn their native language, Dzongkha, through English instruction. The country's very intrepid that way. I guess they decided that Dzongkha wasn't catching on outside. You had to get with the program. Anyway, she said, "Are you from America?" And I said, "Well, yes, I am." And And she looked at me and she said, oh, gee, your friends, are they okay? Because I saw what happened on television. We all saw. And I said, whoa. You know, no, they're not all okay. I knew one person on a plane, and a boy that was in my 3rd grade class was in the South Tower. And she said how sorry she was, that everybody in Bhutan was sorry. And she explained to me that that evening, September 11th, the king lit butter lamps. It's a tantric Buddhist culture. And he declared September 12th to be a national holiday. And on the 12th, her school was closed. All the schools were closed. The government stopped. All the business stopped in the country. Everybody in Bhutan, all 600,000 of them, gathered in monasteries to pray. And she told me that she hoped the chaos would settle down soon. I couldn't believe she knew the word for chaos. I couldn't believe that a child so young would come up and say hello, let alone talk to you in your own language, let alone be so connected and so caring. And it actually, I think, has a little less to do with her, although she's amazing, and more to do with the country that she's grown up in, where there are no orphans, and there are no orphanages, and there are no beggars. And even though the subsistence level is just a rung up above Cambodia, people are actually connected in a way that I think we've forgotten in other parts of the world. So the point of these very human examples, in contrast to the very technical examples, is that the kinds of amazing things we can do with computers so stretch our imaginations that what we have to do more and more, I think, is just ask how to be better people and ask how better people can do more inspiring things with the technology. So thanks very much.